I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing AI and ethics and how those two important issues are coming together in the law. This episode continues our ongoing discussion on the AI Mastery class, which equips lawyers who are advising on AI with the ability to spot legal issues across legal disciplines and specialties. We have a bunch of episodes in the past covering things like AI and copyright law, antitrust, cyber, litigation, and so many more. You should check out those episodes. There's so much good content for anyone looking to retool as an AI lawyer. And that really will continue with today's episode with a focused conversation on AI and ethics. Ethics, at least in my view, is a big challenge for artificial intelligence laws because it can mean so many different things to so many different people. And it is really difficult to define, to scope, and to create practical steps to manage. To discuss, I've invited two of my colleagues to the podcast, Donald DePass from the DC privacy team and Ana Rumualdo from our Mexico office. Both Ana and Donald have been working with clients to develop AI compliance programs. And one of the top questions they receive is, what is the role of ethics in defining those programs? With that, Ana, Donald, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Scott.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Donald, so maybe we start with you. I'm interested in your perspective is what does AI ethics mean? When people refer to ethics as a legal obligation in connection with their consideration on the development or use of AI, what does that mean to you?
So, Scott, to me, this really boils down to the balance between preventing harms and promoting the development of useful technologies like AI. And in that sense, ethics really underlies a lot of the core elements we talk about in the context of AI governance, when we talk about things like safety and bias and transparency, for example. And so ethics really advances ideas that, products should be safe to use, that there should be measures in place to prevent reasonably foreseeable harms, like discriminatory outcomes, that people should be made aware when their information is being used and processed by AI technologies to help train those technologies or to make automated decisions about those people that may have material consequences for those individuals. There are ideas that people should know if they're interacting with an AI-based tool like a chat function, for example. And finally, there should be processes in place to confirm that systems are working properly as intended, that they're working safely, and that if anything seems to be amiss, that there are processes in place to detect that and to mitigate any potential harms.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important because I think what you're defining, Donald, is this AI ethics as being a compilation of all of the many principles that we are seeing pop up in AI-related legal developments, whether that be, safety or transparency or aspects where we are trying to have the ability for people to opt out, have their data be used properly. In other words, are you thinking that the ethical component of this is really all of those specific actions and specific things that these AI laws are requiring that organizations do all lumped together in one place?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way to look at it. And I would agree with that sort of roll up. It's complying with your organization's principles and whatever applicable legal frameworks may apply to you, and doing that in a good faith fashion that enables you to both meet your obligations, but also to, as we talked about, prevent harms and really promote the useful utilization of these kinds of technologies.
So let's say that those are the must-haves, right? In terms of saying that you would have these are the things you're required to do whenever it is you are developing out AI technology or using AI technology. But I almost think that AI ethics has another component, and that is perhaps what should you do, right? In other words, the question of whether you are able to do something, whether it meets the minimum standard of the requirements of law, that is what you can do. But then there's the next step of whether you should do it. and whether the should do it kind of has a component, a qualitative component that may require organizations to pause for a moment and say, well, this may be an opportunity we could explore, but is this really the way that we would want to take our organization and take the direction of our shape and of our business? And what are the outcomes that could happen if we go in this road?
Yes, I think that's a great point. The first step is to assess, well, what are my legal obligations or, my industry codes of standards that I've agreed to, sort of external sources of requirements that may determine how the organization acts or importantly doesn't act. But the next step, or maybe even a step that precedes that, is figuring out what is the organization's mission? What are our values? How do we want to be perceived in the marketplace? And as we develop or use AI technologies, we want to have that in the back of our mind to make sure that we're acting in accordance with our values as an organization.
Yeah, I think really important. Maybe, Anna, I'm interested in your perspective, not only on kind of what AI and ethics means to you, but also importantly, from your point of view, how organizations are approaching the balance of these issues, the opportunities that AI creates, while also at the same time trying to manage the important ethical considerations and associated legal obligations that organizations have in the development or use of that technology.
Of course, this is interesting because given that the great definition that Donald gave us, it's a very good high-level definition. And it's a definition of a concept that sometimes is difficult to grasp because sometimes it seems difficult to measure or to ensure compliance with ethics. Seems like too theoretical, right? But as Donald was mentioning, and as you were mentioning this, in this context, it refers to ensure the upholding of certain principles: transparency, privacy, safety, security. And in this way, implementing appropriate data governance and effective human rights oversight are essential components in ensuring ethical and responsible use of AI within an organization. So organizations should have clear lines of reporting and management structures, appropriate policies and procedures, ongoing training, and impact and risk assessments, and regular audits, and ensuring that no aspect of an organization operates in isolation. This is very important, that there are no one sole area that develops a technology and is not communicating with the rest of an organization because of the consequences that it may have. So when you're using AI, it's important to develop a robust governance ecosystem. This refers to an ecosystem, to an organization communicating within itself. So doing so, it creates a future grounded on ethical values and responsible innovation. And companies need to monitor not only developing legal requirements, which we're seeing now, and codes of conduct and guidance, but companies, and this is very important, this is critical, need to make determinations on AI and ethics, even in circumstances where there are gaps in legislation and regulation, to reduce business risks and at least keep pace with societal expectations. Because where regulatory frameworks may take longer to establish, this vigilance is particularly important to ensure responsible practice. So this is a key question when we're talking about ethics. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So you should ask this question when you're deploying a technology.
So Anna, you're making a few really good and important points that I want to just maybe tease out a little bit further. I think one of the things that you said is the establishment of a governance process that would have stakeholders across the organization to be considering different types of AI use cases. Let's pause there for a moment, because that will be a frequent refrain that listeners of this mastery series has heard before. But it also, I think, has a unique role in trying to get out ahead of ethical considerations in that question of whether just because you can, should you? Because at least the way that I think about this is that when there is a business opportunity available with respect to AI, oftentimes the value of that opportunity can have champions internally who are very vested in the success of that idea. And they will be very passionate, perhaps, in pushing that idea out within their organization. And not to say that they are oblivious of the risk, but it's just that sometimes the risk itself, that question of the should, is not as top of mind when they are seeing the immediate opportunity in front of them. And one of the values of thinking about things from an ethical point of view, and perhaps instilling that in the governance process, is that to act as a check when an AI use case or an AI related initiative is first being presented. So you almost have kind of an independent person who is very much wants to see the organization succeed, but is looking at this idea not from perhaps the most immediate ROI that that idea can create, but instead looking at it from the perspective of long term, is this something that we should do?
Yeah, that's why you should involve the rest of the team. I understand that if you have a business idea and you can implement that business idea and it's very interesting, yeah, you should just involve the rest of the team just to be aware of the risks. That's the main idea of the just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's not like we're stoppers and we're suggesting to stop a business idea. On the contrary, just to be aware of probably the trade-offs that will involve the deployment of that technology.
So, Donald, Anna's making some really interesting points, and I'm interested in your perspective on it. Because from a practical perspective, one important challenge is, well, whose role is it within an organization to consider the ethical implications of any AI use case, whether it's a use or a development? If we're saying that ethical components have to be instilled in the process, and to do so, we're pulling in stakeholders from across the organization to be able to consider it. Whose job is it to think about the ethical issues? Because, while most organizations may be on board with having that multidisciplinary approach, most organizations don't have an in-house ethicist who is going to be thinking about this from that particular perspective. So what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to something we talked about earlier, where these ethical considerations really touch on many aspects of AI governance. And so I don't think many of our clients aren't finding it, at least at this point in the evolution of AI technology, necessary to hire an ethicist specifically devoted to this issue, right? But they are forming these multidisciplinary committees with expertise in security, in privacy, in IP and licensing that can provide sort of a comprehensive view into how these technologies are being developed and how they're being used, and whether those align with applicable rules and the purposes that the organization intends to use the technology for. And so many of our clients are finding that to be an effective tool. One interesting question, though, is at what point should something be raised to the committee? Is it any time the organization wants to use an AI-enabled technology? For some organizations, that may be the answer. For others, that may be overwhelming, and they're finding a need to sort of define what sorts of triggers are sufficiently material to require the use of the AI ethics committee in order to weigh in and make sure that the technologies are being used in ways that meet the needs of the organization and that comply with the organization's ethics and legal and regulatory commitments.
So are we thinking then, Donald, as part of that, is there, and almost in some ways, is there as the development or consideration in this space to developing out what those AI values look like, right? In other words, if we're saying that this is the difference between can versus should, the should still has to be directed and organized in some way, because probably people are going to come up with different views of whether it should or not. And I'm thinking, there's been obviously very prominent companies in the data space who have developed out a privacy story that is different than just doing everything that's permitted by law. Is that the wave of the future in AI, or is it intentionally not so?
Yeah, I think very well maybe, but it's difficult to predict what, a use case will look like 3 years from now, let alone maybe even next year, given the pace at which this technology is innovating and evolving. So I think when organizations do find that sort of framing useful, it may be helpful to try to state those at a higher level, although not such a high level that they're meaningless. It's a tricky balance to strike.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like in some ways you'll start to see real corollaries in this discussion to many of the principles that drive ESG oriented debates and concerns around how organizations, maybe with the best intents, are defining out how they are managing these issues with their ethical hats on. And then almost later on, if they don't do that correctly or deliberately, then they end up getting in trouble for it.
That's right, Scott. It's one of those areas where you don't always get rewarded for having the best intention if the outcome is perceived to be negative or perceived to be suboptimal. And it's something that many of our clients are finding challenging to implement frameworks that are constructive and help them to meet what they view as their ethical obligations while not sort of setting themselves up for second guessing in the future if things don't exactly pan out how they'd intended.
So, Anna, next question for you is Donald's articulated some specific risks around how organizations are managing against the ethical issues in connection with any AI use case. From your perspective, what is the value that's being created to start addressing these issues early on in the process?
That's an interesting question, and probably we can compare it with privacy by design. So when you're aware of those risks from the outset, you probably can manage the results better during these outcomes. For example, you can take into consideration one of the international standards that refer to ethical consideration in system design. And those standards refer that you can put together a team of engineers that consider ethical aspects of the system design for you to be aware of the trade-offs and the potential consequences during the life cycle of the implementation of said technology. So one of the benefits is that you'll be prepared. Probably, I mean, like Donald said, it's difficult to make a prediction. We just want to make a predictions all the time. It's like using AI, it's like having these magical balls for predicting the future. We cannot predict the future. We cannot predict the outcomes necessarily, but we can be prepared for some potential scenarios. So that's the value of being aware of those risks at the beginning. And probably if you're in a jurisdiction where there are no laws specifically regarding to the implementation of AI or no guidance or not proper guidances, since we are on a regulatory trend, eventually regulation will come. So if you're taking those risks now, you're aware of those potential scenarios now, you probably will be more prepared or better prepared for the time when this regulation comes.
So it's almost like considering these issues now is really designed to future-proof your offering or future-proof your use case such that you may not have predicted exactly right what the future regulation will require, but you will be much better off having worked through these principles at the outset and then later closing off any gaps versus not having done any of these things and then later being required to comply with a much more robust set of regulations and have to reevaluate existing business plans.
That's right. I couldn't say better.
Well, I guess maybe then is how do organizations get started? Maybe Donald, I'll ask you, and as we wind up our conversation here, how, from your perspective, are organizations starting to lean into the adoption of this type of ethical framework and ethical process around AI, and where do they start?
Yeah, so I think there are a few answers. One is the development of an AI, or maybe not even AI specific, but an ethics policy, right? That does outline what are our values, what do we stand for, and importantly, what do we view as maybe unacceptable to help guide our use cases and future product development. And then as Anna touched on, and you teed up, this is really an issue that is relevant throughout the life cycle of an AI product. And so implementing processes like risk assessments and product reviews that touch on each piece or each major stage of the development and deployment of an AI enabled product can help establish a framework to facilitate the ethical use of these technologies. And that can prompt questions like, well, what data are we using to train our models? And, how is that data obtained? Is it something that we collected directly from users, or did we source it from third parties? Regardless of the answer to that question, do we have appropriate permissions in place to use the data as we intend to? Do we need to collect consents or provide notices in ways that maybe we haven't yet? And, sort of taking it from that initial step of data collection to each stage throughout the process, whether it's training the model or deploying it live in production and monitoring whether it's being used safely and as intended, and that there aren't consequences like bias that are being perpetuated. Sort of having processes in place at each stage and developing a policy to guide that analysis and to document it to show that the organization has taken this seriously and that it's made a good faith effort at promoting the ethical use of the technology can help organizations go a long way.
Yeah, maybe I would add to that, Donald, as one of the things that would need to be considered as part of that process is a specific and concrete ask and prompt for reviewers to not only evaluate what is it that is being proposed today, but also importantly, where can that product or use case go in the future? So in other words, evaluating not only whatever the minimal set of facts that you have around what a use case looks like, but also anticipating where does this move 2, 3, 4 steps down the process so that you're trying to get out ahead of those issues. And if those are issues the organization is not comfortable with, putting in the safeguards now and the limitations now to set expectations is that maybe we're comfortable with use case A, but use case 1A and 2A and 3A, we're not comfortable with, and making sure that we have established the right boundaries to prevent those use cases that we do not want to proceed with in the future.
That's right, Scott. And I'd add, education here is an important component that we haven't touched on yet. It's one thing to create policies and document procedures, but if the folks that are using and developing these technologies aren't aware of those requirements and aren't trained on using or implementing the safeguards that have been developed, then they're really not going to be effective. And so organizations also need to be really mindful and thoughtful and intentional about educating their workforce about the rules that are in place to make sure that the processes that are being developed are working effectively.
Well, really insightful insights from both of you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to learn about how is it that AI and ethics are coming together. And Ana and Donald, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Scott. Happy to be here. And thank you so much, Donald.
Yes, thank you both for the great conversation. Scott, thanks again for having us.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.